Welcome to Big Questions, Episode 7, Is God a Moral Monster? Part 2, Slavery. This series of episodes was inspired by the book Is God a Moral Monster? By Paul Copan, which goes into this topic in a lot more detail. We hope to cover some of the highlights in these episodes. This is part 2 of the series. If you haven't already watched part 1, we recommend that you watch it first before viewing this episode. In this session, we are going to take a closer look at the topic of slavery. What do you think of when you think of slavery? If you're like me, you probably have images of people being bought and sold, treated like property, mistreated I should say, lots of abuse, and all slaves desperate to escape. It's usually a horrific situation. Well, what if I told you that that picture is not what the Bible is talking about when it describes slavery? And that sometimes slavery could be a merciful provision. The stereotypical view of slavery is more in line with the ancient Near East culture and has been well documented historically and archaeologically. In the culture that surrounded God's people Israel 4,000 years ago, the treatment of slaves was brutal and demeaning. Human trafficking and profiteering were part of everyday society. Slaves were completely at the mercy of their masters, with no rights at all, and runaway slaves were returned to their masters and often killed. The Old Testament laws improved significantly on this Near East culture, and the good treatment of slaves was encouraged by various rules. For example, in Exodus 21 verse 1 it says, "If you buy a Hebrew servant," many translations say slave here, "he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free, without paying anything." Later in that same chapter, it makes allowance for slaves to choose to stay permanently with their master because they love them. Obviously, this would only happen if a slave was treated well. Also, human trafficking is strictly forbidden by the law of Moses and is punishable by death. In Exodus 21 verse 16 it says, "Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession." Slaves also had rights and were to be released if abused or mistreated. In Exodus 21 verse 26 it says, "An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye." In contrast to the ancient Near East culture of the day, under God's law, runaway slaves from other nations were to be given refuge in Israel, not handed back to their masters. Deuteronomy 23 verses 15 and 16 says clearly, "If a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand them over to their master. Let them live among you wherever they like, and whatever town they choose. Do not oppress them." In light of these passages and others, it should be noted that in the Old Testament, the type of slavery that was permitted is more like indentured servitude. That is, working to pay off a debt. Not what we think of normally as slavery. You would probably understand what your friend means when they say to you that their job feels like slavery. Many of us are slaves to the grind, burdened down by financial debt. Even the Bible speaks of this when it says in Proverbs 22 verse 7, "The borrower is the slave of the lender." Perhaps it would help to think of apprenticeships, school debt, contractual obligations, and the like, in order to find a modern-day comparison of what the Bible means by slavery or servitude. Even in modern sports we have owners, and the players get traded or sold, and no one gets upset because we understand the context. In fact, trade deadline day is a huge media event in many places. This is more like what God's Word provides for, not the oppressive slavery that took place in the southern United States in the 19th century. That kind of slavery was a cruel invention of men, not God. In Old Testament Bible times, there was no social security network like many modern nations have today. So Israelites sometimes had to sell themselves to get through difficult financial times. The loss of a job, a failed crop, or just plain old bad luck could be devastating for someone living in the time of Moses. Jobs weren't readily available since there was no complex industry. So most people just worked for themselves, farming, selling things, etc., and could easily fall into poverty. God's law allowed the provision of servitude for these desperate circumstances. In Leviticus 25 verses 39 to 40 it states, "If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers or temporary residents among you. They are to work for you until the year of Jubilee." In summary, we can see that these so-called slavery laws of the Old Testament were there to control and regulate a fallen human problem, not idealize it or condone it. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe to stay in touch with future videos, or leave us a comment.